What's up everyone? Today we will be looking at Mark Fisher's final work, Acid Communism. This was his follow-up book to Capitalist Realism. So if you haven't read the book or just want a brief summary of what it's all about, please feel free to watch my previous video on Capitalist Realism. It will help a bit with the context of this video. But firstly, thank you for clicking on the video. If you enjoy the content, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel a lot. So without any further ado, let's dive right in. We left off with Capitalist Realism, where Fisher gave a sort of neo-Marxist critique of modern-day capitalism and also criticized neoliberalism. The whole premise was that capitalism has shaped our consciousness and our reality, or rather our perception of reality, so much that we can't imagine any other economic system than capitalism. He uses the famous phrase, "It is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism." In Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher didn't really give a solution to all of his critiques. He wanted to do this in Acid Communism, but sadly he passed away before finishing it. However, he left just enough so that we could get the general gist of the idea he was going for. So why did he call it Acid Communism? It's not exactly a well-known term in everyday economic lingo. The word acid here doesn't refer to the corrosive chemical, but instead alludes to the psychedelic drug LSD. And that's important. At first glance, the two terms acid and communism don't seem all that compatible. But Fisher chose them deliberately, aiming to provoke the reader. He wanted to signal what might be needed to ignite or revive the emancipatory potential of communism. In Capitalist Realism, he talks about the future, or more precisely, our attitude towards the future. If we think back, each decade had its own distinct style. Each century had its own culture. Each century had its own fashion sense. Every era was known for striving towards something. In the 2000s, when I used to think about the future, there was hope. There was a sense of possibility. We looked at things differently. But now, everything feels dull. All the creative projects feel like remakes, a kind of regurgitation of the past. Nothing new is being pursued. Society just is. And apparently, that is how it's going to stay. The future is now, and the future is stale. Fisher argued that this is one of the psychological effects of capitalism. It convinces us that there is no alternative. That yes, capitalism has its flaws, but we have nothing better, so we just stay stuck in this rut we're in. This attitude, he says, comes from many factors, which I covered in the previous video, Capitalist Realism. But one of the biggest drivers is the historical baggage of communism, especially that of Stalinism. The problem with communism is that it's very vague. Every nation or leader that adopts it seems to reshape it into their own version. Mao with Maoism, Lenin with Leninism, the Kim dynasty with whatever ism they claimed, and then obviously Stalinism. Fisher, writing as a more contemporary or neo-Marxist, argued that we shouldn't look at these distorted versions as definite failures of communism. Instead, we should see them as warped reflections of a deeper, still unrealized potential, a potential that hasn't been properly imagined or brought into reality. So, what is he actually suggesting? Let's say if we were to look at a parrot. You know, everyone has that one uncle that has a parrot in the living room. Or maybe it's just here in South Africa. Or maybe it's just me. But in any case, those birds tend to pluck out all their feathers, except the ones right on top of their head, because they obviously can't reach them. They do this because they go mad from the horrible psychosis that the confinement or the cage inflicts on them. If we were to look at the parrot, it would be foolish to diagnose the parrot as the problem, when the real issue is clearly the cage. And that's what capitalism is. We see the flaws all around us and try to diagnose and fix them. But the reason nothing changes is because we're looking in the wrong place. It's not the parrot, it's the cage. So if we want to change the system, we can't do it within the system. You can't try and stop climate change with capitalistic regulations within a capitalistic system. You need to change the system to invoke real change. You can't bargain with the tiger when your head is in its mouth. So what was Fisher's solution? Well, he takes us back to the psychedelic movements of the 20th century. The phrase acid communism deliberately invokes the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s, a time when political revolution was imagined hand in hand with personal liberation, psychedelic experimentation, and cultural upheaval. Fisher believed this era held untapped potential. Not because everyone back then had all the answers, but because at least they asked the right questions. How can we live more freely? What does it mean to share joy and creativity? For Fisher, these questions had been shut down by neoliberalism, which replaced dreams of liberation with individualism, debt, and anxiety. Central to acid communism is the idea that capitalism has colonized not only our economies and institutions, but also our inner lives, our dreams, our desires, and sense of what is possible. This is what Fisher called, as mentioned, capitalist realism, the belief that there is no alternative to the current system. Under capitalist realism, the imagination is stunted. People begin to see struggle and stress and loneliness as natural parts of life, rather than consequences of a system that prioritizes profit over people. Acid communism aimed to break the spell by reconnecting with the parts of culture that inspired collectivity, playfulness, and defiance. Fisher wasn't proposing a return to the 1960s utopia, but rather a retrieval of what has been lost. This belief that everyday life could be transformed. Music, art, education, and psychedelics weren't just aesthetic side notes. They were tools to shift consciousness and awaken people to the possibility of a different world. Fisher wanted to politicize joy. He wanted people to realize that the drudgery of modern day life, working long hours, being constantly online, competing endlessly, wasn't natural or desirable. It was the result of a system that thrived by keeping people isolated and exhausted. At the end of the day, Fisher wanted us to regain the glimmer of hope in our eyes, the notion and attitude that there is a different future out there for all of us, that tomorrow will be better than today, and that change is imminent. It sounds like a lot like Nietzsche's slave morality to a certain extent, I think. I heard this one story on one of these bro podcasts or self-improvement podcasts that fits perfectly with this. It goes like this. If I had to go to the grocery store to buy milk or bread or whatever, and the store was literally just around the corner, I'd walk. That would take me around 5 minutes. If it were let's say a block away, I'd still walk. Let's say this would take me about 7 minutes. But if it were 2 blocks away, I'd rather drive, because walking would then take 10 minutes, which is my personal cut-off point for what I would consider walking distance. But if I drive, it would only take me 3 minutes to get there. So in this case, with the grocery store being 2 blocks away, it actually became more time efficient than if it just was around the corner. So what am I saying? Well, sometimes it's better to be in a worse position because it forces you to stand up and find a solution, which in the long run is much better for you. In life, the worst situations are those that aren't quite terrible enough. They are just bearable enough for you to sit back and do nothing about them. And capitalism keeps us just happy enough. It keeps us on the verge of giving up, but not quite. Just enough for us to keep going and still do nothing about it. And I think that will be all for the video. Thank you for watching.